Hey everybody, and welcome back to Pulp Hero Audio. Today I want to talk about and analyze just a little bit one of the most famous scenes from one of Robert E. Howard's Conan stories. And that is the scene in which Conan the Barbarian is crucified. Now, the crucifixion of Conan takes place specifically in Robert E. Howard's story, A Witch Shall Be Born, that was first published in Weird Tales magazine back in December of 1934. Now, since A Witch Shall Be Born was published, the Conan crucifixion scene, it's been recreated in comic books. It was adapted into the Tree of Woe scene from the Conan the Barbarian movie starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'm sure those who have seen that movie remember that, when James Earl Jones as Thulsa Doom is like, crucify him, and then you see Conan nailed to the tree. Now, when you start talking about a literary character like Conan being crucified, that's naturally going to invite both comparisons and contrasts, I think, to, of course, the most famous crucifixion, that being the biblical account of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit, as really I don't see any way to get around it. So let's consider some of the contrasts, because I do think the situations are very different in a lot of ways. Because I think the first thing we should observe is that Conan is not a willing sacrifice, okay? It's not like that he meant for that to happen. It's not like that he's there on purpose or anything like that. And as far as sacrifices go, Conan wouldn't make a very good one, because he's certainly no innocent. After all, it's Conan. We all know the lines: Conan, the thief, reaver, slayer. Conan is no innocent lamb by any means. So certainly he doesn't really fit with that concept. And also, Conan has no intention of dying on that cross. He is totally concerned with saving himself, getting off of that cross, prolonging his own life. He's out to save himself. He's not out to save anyone else. He's not trying to save you or me or anybody. Conan is just trying to save Conan. There is no grander purpose to Conan's crucifixion. Now, while Jesus was a willing sacrifice with a greater purpose, Conan is not willing. And his only purpose really is to not die. And with Jesus, of course, there's this sense in the story that this is an important event, okay, for both mortal man as well as the divine. But in Conan's fictional world, no one cares what's happening to Conan. Other than Conan, no one cares what is happening to Conan. Conan's own god, Crom, doesn't care what is happening to Conan. That's sort of the nature of Crom in the Howard stories. Crom doesn't care, okay? And we also see that the attitudes, if you look at, Jesus versus Conan, you see the attitudes are very different as well. With Conan, in A Witch Shall Be Born, Howard writes, "A red lust for vengeance swept away the thought. Curses ebbed fitfully from the man's lips." So we've got Conan up there on the cross thinking about nothing but vengeance and cursing and that kind of thing. That is certainly a far cry from the famous "Father, forgive them, they know not what they do," as spoken by Jesus on the cross. So very different attitudes there as well. When looking at them this way, the two executions, the two crucifixions, seem very different. But I do think there are some similarities, some parallels that Howard draws here beyond simply the method of execution and, of course, the terrible pain that is suffered. Now, in the biblical account, Jesus is crucified by Roman authorities with the urging of certain elements of the Jewish leadership there in Jerusalem, according to the Bible. Now, Conan, in A Witch Shall Be Born, Conan is crucified by a man named Constantius, who has aligned himself with the witch Salome, or Salome, whichever pronunciation you prefer. Now, of Salome, I think this is interesting. Howard tells us this about Salome in her own words, where she says, "Every century a witch shall be born. Each was named Salome. I too am Salome. It was always Salome the witch. It will always be Salome the witch. Even when the mountains of ice have roared down from the pole and ground the civilizations to ruin, and a new world has risen from the ashes and dust. Even then there shall be Salomes to walk the earth, to trap men's hearts by sorcery, to dance before the kings of the world and see the heads of the wise men fall at their pleasure." Now, that whole business with dancing before the kings of the world and seeing the heads of the wise men fall at their pleasure, now that would be a very direct reference to the woman Salome, so named by the Jewish historian Josephus. Now, Salome, she was the daughter of Herodias and the stepdaughter of Herod Antipas, who was a first-century Jewish king with ties to the Romans. And it is she, this Salome, as named by Josephus, who in the Bible was the one who danced before King Herod, dancing before the kings of the world, prompting him to offer her virtually anything she wants, to which she demands the head of John the Baptist after conferring with her mother about it. So seeing the heads of the wise men fall at their pleasure, in this case the head of the Jewish prophet John the Baptist. So in Salome, in Howard's story, with Salome, we have sort of a symbolic stand-in, if you will, for the Jewish element of the crucifixion. But now, who actually carries out the crucifixion? Well, in Howard's story, that would be this soldier, this general, this man Constantius. Now, with a name like Constantius, I can only imagine that was derived from the name Constantine, which is, of course, a Roman name. So there with Constantius, we have the stand-in for Rome being the one to drive the nails into Conan. So both elements are represented there, the Jewish element as well as the Roman one actually carrying out the crucifixion. Now, speaking of Rome, Rome at the time, they're in the 1st century, Rome was considered the height of civilization. And Constantius, in our Conan story, is most definitely a son of civilization. So once again, I think Howard is going back to one of his favorite themes there, pointing out that so-called civilization is often more barbaric, just as barbaric or more barbaric than barbarism itself, as we see that it's so-called civilized men that have devised such a cruel method of inflicting torture and death upon other human beings, that being crucifixion, being nailed to a cross. Now, kind of an interesting thing comes up here when you read the story. When Howard, had Conan put on the cross, what kind of cross did he intend? What did Howard visualize in his head when he nailed Conan to that cross? I don't know if we'll ever know, or if there's some other evidence out there that tells us specifically. Now, I think some would say, maybe most would say, that, it was probably the traditional T-shaped cross, like one would think of with, Christ's crucifixion. But if you look at a lot of the Conan-based artwork, artists often depict Conan on this sort of X-shaped cross. Then, of course, in the movie, they put him on a literal tree, not just a symbolic one, but a literal tree. So we see that as well as, the X-shaped cross using. Now, I'm guessing that the X-shaped cross was used by artists and writers in comic books and things like that as a way to sort of differentiate Conan from the more familiar cross of Jesus. And perhaps they were thinking to thwart anyone becoming too upset over it being a little too close to that of Jesus, like maybe it might offend someone or something like that. But, is there some evidence in the story for the X-shaped cross, or at least a different shaped cross? Now, with Jesus, we think of the 3 nails, one in each hand, and then a single nail, the 3rd nail, going through both feet at the base of the cross. But I think it's interesting that in Howard's story, Howard specifically says that 4 nails, not 3, were used on Conan, one in each hand and each foot. Now, if Howard meant for Conan's crucifixion to mimic Christ's, as far as all the physical details are concerned, why the 4th nail? Why that difference in detail? So I think that this argues for at least the possibility of a different shape to the cross. And frankly, I prefer the X-shaped cross for Conan because it makes Conan's situation distinct, visually different, entirely his own sort of situation. Now, with that in mind, what about those, who might actually find the imagery of this crucifixion of Conan as somehow being, sacrilege or some kind of blasphemy or something like that? Personally, I don't think that was Robert E. Howard's intention. And I don't really think that is taking place here at all. And that's speaking as someone, if I could be personal for a moment, that's speaking as someone who is a Christian. I don't take offense to any of this. Yeah, sure, if you read the stories, Conan does at times save individuals. He plays the hero from time to time. But, he's never really presented as any kind of, great savior, and certainly not a divine one, like he's the son of God or something. Conan, he's just a man. And, I don't think any Christian would argue that Jesus was the only person to ever be crucified. Now, while there are certainly elements to his story that are unique, the use of crucifixion itself as a means of punishment and execution, that was widely practiced by the Romans. Even within the biblical story itself, you've got two thieves who were also crucified along with Jesus. So I don't really see Howard's use of crucifixion here as being some sort of an affront to Christianity. So I really don't see why any Christian would be offended by it unless, they're just looking for something. So just one final note, for those who have seen the movie, I don't know anyone who doesn't love that moment when Conan kills the vulture with his own teeth while he's nailed on the tree of woe. Well, if you haven't read it, that happens in the original Howard story too. So that was something that the movie took directly from Howard's story, which is pretty cool. Go check out A Witch Shall Be Born, and let me know what you think of it, what you think of what I've said here in the comments, and be sure and subscribe if you haven't done that already, and thanks for listening. Later.